It was a Friday night in late October when Daniel found himself completely alone in his parents' two-story house on Willow Street. His mom and dad had left earlier in the evening for a weekend trip to visit his aunt, leaving him in charge of the place. At first, Daniel was thrilled. He was 18, finally trusted enough to stay alone without constant check-ins. He imagined hours of uninterrupted gaming, watching late-night horror movies, and maybe even inviting a friend or two over the next day. The house was quiet when they left, too quiet compared to what he was used to. His mom always had the television on in the background or the radio humming softly in the kitchen. But now, there was only the faint ticking of the living room clock and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards whenever he shifted his weight. After making himself some microwave popcorn, Daniel headed upstairs to his room. He closed the door halfway, sat at his desk, and put on his headset for a round of online gaming. Hours slipped by quickly. The only light came from his monitor and the faint glow of the hallway nightlight his parents insisted on leaving plugged in. Sometime around midnight, during a pause in the game, Daniel removed his headset and realized just how silent the house was. The silence was almost heavy, pressing in from every direction. That's when he heard it, a faint rustling sound downstairs, like the brush of fabric against wood. He froze, straining to listen. It came again, softer this time, like someone shifting their weight slowly. At first, Daniel told himself it was the house settling. Their place was old, and it always made odd sounds, groans, pops, the occasional rattle of pipes. But this sounded different. It had rhythm, almost intentional, like cautious footsteps moving across the living room. His heart rate quickened. He took a deep breath and told himself not to panic. Maybe it was just the wind against the windows. Maybe he was overthinking. He stood up, opened his door a little wider, and listened again. The sound had stopped. For a while, nothing happened, so Daniel laughed nervously and went back to his game. He even typed in the chat that his haunted house was making noises again. But about 15 minutes later, as he reached for his soda, he heard another sound, this time unmistakably coming from the kitchen. A soft clink, like metal against glass. Daniel's stomach tightened. He paused, debating whether to call his parents, but he knew they were already hours away and probably asleep. He considered calling a friend, but he didn't want to be teased for being paranoid. Gathering what courage he had, he grabbed the aluminum baseball bat he kept in the corner of his room and began creeping down the stairs. The air on the first floor felt colder, somehow heavier than upstairs. The faint nightlight by the hallway barely illuminated the shadows stretching across the floor. Daniel stepped carefully, his bare feet making almost no sound against the wood. When he reached the kitchen doorway, he flicked on the light. Everything looked normal. The countertops were clear, the sink was empty, and the fridge was closed. Still, something felt wrong. He stepped inside, bat raised, and that's when he noticed the back door. It was unlocked. His parents always locked the doors religiously, and he was sure he had double-checked earlier. His throat went dry. Had he forgotten? Or had someone been inside while he was upstairs? Daniel quickly locked the door, twisting the bolt until it clicked firmly into place. He stood there for a moment, listening, heart pounding in his ears. When no further sounds came, he tried to reassure himself. Maybe he had left it unlocked after grabbing snacks earlier. It was possible. He returned upstairs, forcing himself to relax. But as he sat down again, he realized he hadn't imagined the earlier sounds. Someone, or something, had been moving in the house. The next hour passed with Daniel on edge, his eyes darting to every shadow. Then came the sound that made his blood run cold. From outside his bedroom door, he heard the faintest whisper. Not words, but the sound of breath, like someone exhaling slowly right on the other side. Daniel's hand tightened around the bat. His mind raced. He hadn't heard footsteps on the stairs. How could someone be standing there without making a sound? He leaned closer, holding his breath, and the whisper came again, barely audible, followed by the faint creak of the floorboard in the hall. Fear surged through him. He wanted to run, to fling open the window and leap outside, but his legs felt heavy, glued to the floor. He swallowed hard and forced himself to move. Slowly, he reached out and pushed his bedroom door open an inch wider. The hallway was empty. The nightlight glowed dimly, casting faint shadows on the walls. There was no one in sight. Daniel's pulse raced, and sweat beaded on his forehead. He stepped into the hall, bat raised high, and checked each room one by one. His parents' bedroom, the bathroom, the guest room. All empty. Finally, he returned to his own room, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia. He locked the door this time and shoved a chair under the handle, just in case. He sat down on his bed, exhausted, trying to convince himself it was all in his head. But then came the final sound, the one that made him know for certain he hadn't imagined anything at all. From just outside his window, 2 stories above the ground, came 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. The window was shut and locked, the curtains drawn, but the knocks had been clear, sharp, intentional. He didn't move, didn't even breathe, his eyes wide with terror as silence reclaimed the room. He stayed like that until dawn, gripping the bat and shaking hands, too afraid to check the window, too afraid to even close his eyes. When morning finally came, the knocks never repeated. His parents returned later that day to find him pale, exhausted, and unwilling to stay another night alone in the house on Willow Street. And to this day, Daniel swears that someone, or something, had been with him that night. Watching, waiting. Ethan lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen. The streets were lined with tidy houses, trimmed hedges, and porch lights that all clicked on around the same time every evening. It was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted peace and safety. That's why, when Ethan's parents took a weekend trip to celebrate their anniversary, he felt confident staying home by himself. He was 19, old enough to take care of himself, and figured a weekend of solitude might be nice. No rules, no one asking him to take out the trash or turn down his music. Just him, his laptop, and endless hours to binge movies or play games. The first night went smoothly. He ordered pizza, watched a few comedies, and stayed up until nearly 3 in the morning scrolling through social media. The second night, however, would be one he never forgot. It started with a phone call. Ethan's cell buzzed on the coffee table around 11:15 p.m. The screen showed an unknown number. At first, he thought it might be a scammer, so he ignored it. But then it rang again, and again, the same number, calling 3 times in less than 2 minutes. Against his better judgment, Ethan answered. "Hello," he said cautiously. For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then came a low voice, raspy and uneven, as if the speaker's mouth was too close to the receiver. "Why are you awake?" the voice asked. Ethan froze, every muscle in his body tightening. "Who is this?" he demanded. The line went dead. His heart pounded. He laughed nervously to himself, telling his racing mind it was just some prank caller. Probably kids from school messing around. He blocked the number and tried to forget about it. But about half an hour later, as he was turning off the downstairs lights to head upstairs, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a different, unknown number. He hesitated, then answered, his voice firm. "I don't know who this is, but you need to stop calling me." The same rasping voice replied, "I can see you." Ethan's blood ran cold. He spun around, staring through the darkened living room. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, darker. He rushed to the front door, double-checking the locks, then ran from window to window, yanking the blinds shut. By the time he reached his bedroom upstairs, his hands were shaking. He set the phone on his nightstand, convinced he'd just been targeted by a sick prank. He tried to calm down, telling himself it was a coincidence, that someone was trying to scare him. But the phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but curiosity overpowered fear. Slowly, he pressed it to his ear. This time the voice whispered, "Don't close the blinds. I like watching." Ethan's stomach twisted. He immediately hung up, silenced his phone, and crawled into bed, pulling the blanket over his head like he was a kid again. He lay there, heart hammering, listening for any sound outside. Minutes dragged by. Just as he started to think maybe the caller had given up, there came a sound that made him sit bolt upright. 3 deliberate taps against his bedroom window. He didn't move. His blinds were closed, but he could see the faint outline of the window frame in the glow of the streetlight outside. Another set of taps came, slower this time, followed by the unmistakable scrape of fingernails against glass. Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. Instead, he grabbed his baseball bat and stood at the far side of the room, staring at the window. The sound stopped. Silence returned. For the next 2 hours, he sat in the corner of his room, bat clutched in both hands, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and he drifted into a restless sleep. When morning came, Sunlight spilled across his room, and everything seemed normal again. The window looked untouched from the inside. He tried to convince himself it had all been a dream, maybe his imagination running wild after those creepy phone calls. But when he finally gathered the courage to go outside, his stomach dropped. On the siding just below his bedroom window were 3 long, jagged scratch marks etched deep into the paint. And on the ground, pressed into the soft dirt of the flower bed, were the clear impressions of footprints, bare, human feet. Whoever had called him hadn't just been watching. They had been standing there, just inches away, waiting in the dark while he lay inside, completely alone. Ethan never answered another unknown number again. On the outskirts of a small town sat a house with pale blue siding and a sagging front porch. It belonged to Mia and her parents, but for one weekend in late November, she was left to take care of it alone. Her parents had gone on a short trip to visit relatives 2 states over, leaving her in charge of the house, the dog, and herself. Mia was 17, and while she had been home alone plenty of times before, this was the first time she'd be staying overnight without anyone else. She told herself it would be fine. She had homework to catch up on, snacks in the kitchen, and her loyal golden retriever, Scout, who never left her side. The first night passed without much trouble. She curled up on the couch, watched a few movies, and fell asleep before midnight. But on the second night, something felt off. It started around 10 p.m. when Scout began growling low in his throat. Mia had been scrolling through her phone, half paying attention to a show on Netflix, when she noticed the dog stiffen, ears perked, eyes locked on the kitchen doorway. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, glancing into the dark kitchen. Nothing moved. Still, Scout's growl deepened, his fur bristling. Mia grabbed the remote and muted the TV. The house fell silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. She held her breath, listening, and then she heard it, a faint tapping sound, like fingernails brushing lightly against wood. Her stomach tightened. The sound seemed to be coming from the basement door at the far end of the kitchen. Mia's parents always kept that door locked at night. The basement wasn't finished, just a concrete floor and old shelves lined with dusty boxes. But the door had a habit of rattling when the wind blew, so they usually made sure it was bolted shut. Gathering her courage, Mia stood and walked slowly into the kitchen, Scout trailing at her heels, growling softly. The tapping stopped as soon as she stepped closer. She reached for the door and tugged gently on the knob. Locked. Secure. She exhaled, relief flooding through her, and whispered to Scout, "See? Nothing's wrong." She gave him a pat on the head and turned back toward the living room. That's when the sound came again. Not a tap this time, but a heavy thud. Something, or someone, had hit the other side of the basement door hard enough to make it shudder in its frame. Mia froze, her heart pounding. Scout barked, lunging toward the door, nails scrabbling against the floor. "No, no, no," Mia whispered, backing away. She grabbed her phone and considered calling her parents, but she knew they were hours away and couldn't do anything. She thought about calling the police, but what would she even say? That her basement door made a noise? The thud didn't repeat, but the silence that followed was worse. It was as if the entire house was holding its breath. Mia finally retreated upstairs, locking herself in her bedroom with Scout at her side. She left the lamp on and tried to distract herself with music, but every creak of the house set her nerves on edge. Eventually, exhaustion pulled her into an uneasy sleep. Sometime after 2 a.m., she woke to Scout barking furiously at the bedroom door. She sat up, heart racing, and then she heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps creaking up the stairs. Her blood turned cold. Mia grabbed the baseball bat her brother had left in her closet and held it tight, her hands trembling. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside her bedroom. Silence. She stared at the door, wide-eyed, waiting for the knob to turn, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Minutes dragged by. Finally, she mustered the courage to tiptoe over and press her ear to the wood. Nothing. Just the sound of her own ragged breathing. Slowly, she crouched down to peek through the gap at the bottom of the door. At first, all she saw was the faint glow of the hallway night light, but then she swore she saw the shadow of bare feet standing still, facing her door. Mia stumbled back, stifling a scream. Scout barked louder, throwing himself against the door, but when she looked again, the shadow was gone. She didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, shaken and exhausted, Mia crept downstairs. The basement door was still locked tight. She inspected every window, every door, every corner of the house. Nothing seemed out of place. By the time her parents returned that afternoon, she felt almost foolish telling them what happened. Maybe it had been a dream, she thought. Maybe her imagination had gotten the better of her. But when her father went to check the basement later that evening, he called her down with a pale face. The lock on the inside of the basement door, the one facing the concrete steps, was broken, as if someone had tried to force their way out. To this day, Mia never stays alone in that house overnight.